If we knew that we were getting casualties, we would call the first team in. They would come, surgeons would come in and triage the patients, but often they were already in the operating room, so was second team and third team. So as nurses, we triage. So here I am, a year out of school, making decisions that we're going to operate on somebody or we're going to put somebody in a corner.
Hello, and welcome to the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. This is where we share stories for inspiration, entertainment, and encouragement, because we all know emergency nurses have the best stories. Now here's your host, Kevin McFarland.
Hey everybody, Kevin McFarland here from the Art of Emergency Nursing, and thanks for listening to the podcast, and thanks for downloading this episode. Now, I sometimes get a chance to do really cool things, and just a few weeks ago was one of those times. I had an opportunity to go to the Emergency Care Conference in New Jersey, in Atlantic City. What an amazing conference. If you ever get a chance to go, it's definitely should be on your to-do list. It is a great conference. The organizers are great. I had such a great time. One of the things I got to do at that conference was to do a live episode of the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast as the closing session. What a super honor to be able to do that. And I got 3 amazing nurses to join me on stage. Now, you're going to hear from each one of these nurses again, because they have so many more stories that absolutely have to be heard on the podcast. So you'll get a chance to hear from them again at some point. I'll definitely be having them on the podcast for more in-depth interviews. In the meantime, what I have for you is I have the closing session of the Emergency Care Conference, and it is a live episode of the Art of Emergency Nursing. And what we talked about was storytelling in emergency nursing, and how the stories we tell oftentimes are how we learn things. So enjoy this special edition of the Art of Emergency Nursing live.
Kevin McFarland.
Well, hi everybody. My name's Kevin McFarland. I'm trying to figure out if I need the lavalier or if I need I think the lavalier is probably going to be fine. My name's Kevin McFarland, and thank you for having me here. This has been an amazing conference. Isn't it great to be back at conferences? Oh my gosh. The coolest thing, my favorite part of ENA is that every year, and it used to be twice a year, every year we get to go and we get to see the people that we only get to see online and on social anymore. But it's always great to be in person and get those hugs and just see folks that you only get to see maybe once or twice a year. For me, I'll get to see a few of you guys at least twice. We'll see each other again in Colorado. But super excited to be. This is the first big conference I've been at in 2 years. So, and what an awesome program and what an awesome job. So big hand to the conference committee. All right, again, not too late to donate. Scan that to donate. Now, disclosures. I forgot. I'm going to get in trouble if I don't do this slide. No financial something. No financial benefit for me. If you can figure something out for me, let me know. Love to talk to you. And no conflict of interest for either the speakers, my guests, or the planners. Now, in case we haven't met, my name's Kevin McFarland, and I am a few things. From Texas, you guys already heard that. Don't boo. I know Texas and New Jersey have a little bit of a thing. A little rivalry when it comes to ENA. I didn't find out about that until after I was at Texas. I'm a transplant, originally from New Mexico. Moved to Houston, Texas, and it's been great. The cool thing about ENA, and if you were in Jessica's networking conference, networking session, the networking that you get to do with ENA is such a cool thing that when I went to Houston, when I moved there, I already had friends because I already met the Houston ENA folks. And I met them at a conference. There was a conference just before I moved there, and I met them at a conference, and they're like, meetings are this day, here's where they're at, we expect to see you, be on time. And I was like, all right. And I automatically had friends. It was great. So a little bit more about me. Again, I'm a nurse. I'm an educator. I'm a husband to an amazing wife who keeps me sane and tries to keep track of me. And I'm also a podcaster. Now, how many folks listen to podcasts? Quick show of hands. Not near enough of you. Not near enough of you. Now, for those of you who don't know what podcasts are little like radio shows or little like almost like little talk shows, depending on anything, and almost anything you want. So I got a chance to teach Jean Prail how to download podcasts to her phone. She's like, oh, I don't have the app. I'm like, oh, you do. So I told her, pull out your phone. She had an iPhone. I said, pull out your phone. I go, see this little icon that says podcast? I go, that's where it's at. So I showed her how to download podcasts. It's something that's already on your phone, and I'm totally addicted. I'm totally addicted to podcasts. And the idea for my podcast came out of a conference not unlike this one. We're at National Leadership. I kind of had the idea that I wanted to start a podcast because I'd been listening to them. I worked nights for a long time in a manufacturing plant, and there's nothing else to do but listen to stuff that I can download to my phone. So I'd download an episode of the podcast and then listen to it at work. And I always said to myself, I want to start a podcast, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to start it on. So it was one of those things I always wanted to do. I remember, and guys, you may be like this, ladies, you may be too. Have you ever thought you wanted to do a hobby, go get all the stuff, and then you're like, I'm not going to do anything with that. Well, I did that the first time, and then later, I was trying to come up with an idea for a podcast, and I was at the leadership orientation in Chicago. Holy cow, was it cold, for those of you who remember, and those of you who may have been there. And late that night, I was hanging out with a bunch of nurses at a bar, and we were doing what a bunch of nurses at a bar do. Well, they were drinking, not me. We were hanging out, having a good time, and we started telling stories. And then what I noticed was it was like a story of, oh my gosh, let me tell you about this patient I had. I'm going to top that with this story. Let me tell you about this patient I had. I'm going to top this with this patient. And we started telling stories, what some would call war stories. And just realizing that from all over the world, there's people there from all over the world, and we could all relate to the same stories. We all had the same stories. We all had a frequent friend that comes to the ER so much you think you know their social security number, right? We all have the diabetic patient that comes back to the ER all the time because they don't take care of themselves. We have a lot of shared experience. And we were sitting there, we were all around the table there having a conversation, and I thought to myself, this would be a cool podcast. So that's what my podcast is about. My podcast is about stories of nurses, stories of emergency nurses, and the patient they take care of. So that's one podcast. And then just because I didn't have enough to do, I started a second podcast. This one's a little bit more clinical. This one's more, and it's with Dr. Lisa Wolf, who some of you may know. And we just kind of talk about triage. And okay, let's talk about abdominal pain and talk about all the things that could go wrong in the abdomen. That one's a little bit more clinical. But the first one, again, is all about stories. And what I love about stories is think about how important stories are to the things you've learned as a nurse, right? If you think back to nursing school, you would hear these lessons and they would tell you these things that were in the textbook. But what made it stick was the stories, right? They could tell you all day in class that if you give Narcan too fast, your patient's going to throw up. But until you do that, or until somebody tells you, hey, let me tell you about a time I did that, then hopefully you can learn from their lessons. So I am in love with nurse stories. Because you know what? We have the best stories, right? Except for if your spouse, whose spouse is not in nursing? Mine's not. Mine's like, if your spouse isn't in nursing, they probably don't want to hear your stories. And that's okay, because we do. We want to hear your stories. But what I'll tell you is I love hearing about all the stories. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a little bit of stories from 3 guests. About 3 guests here to give me a hand. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And oh, look, and they're even in order. Holy cow, I didn't even plan that. Introduce yourself. Oh.
Hi, my name is Julianne Hodgkins. I've been a nurse for just under 3 years. I have my BSN, my CEN, and TNCC.
Hi, my name is Billy Solomos. I've been a nurse for a little over 10 years. I'm currently a nurse educator at St. Joseph's in Patterson and Wayne, New Jersey.
My name's Peggy McMahon, and I'm retired, and I graduated from nursing school in 1966. So I've been a nurse. So I've been a nurse for over 50 some years. But I still teach TNCC and help people with writing.
That's awesome. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go through and tell some stories. And my guess is these are going to be stories that you can relate to. Now, here's the thing that's really powerful. Again, that storytelling, the powerful part about the storytelling is that, to me, is, we can get the facts and figures, but the things that are really going to make lessons stick is the stories. So that's whenever you're precepting somebody, whenever you're teaching somebody new in your emergency department, I want you to think the facts and figures are nice. Being able to show them where the policy is great. But if you have a story, a lot of times that really goes a long way to help solidify that learning. Now, you got to be careful. You don't want to be the hero in every story, right? You don't want to always be the hero. Sometimes the stories I tell is where I'm the clown, right? I'm not the hero, I'm the clown. And sometimes those stories, to me, I always think of it as a way of saying, hey, you know what? Learn something the easy way that I had to learn the hard way. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into some of their stories. And I'm going to ask them to share some stories with you. And my guess is these are going to be things that you can relate to. Now, when I do the podcast, I'm typically at home by myself. They're at home by themselves. We do it on video. And then I release the audio. But they're in the privacy of their own home. So these guys have, super brave to get up here in front of the audience and answer these questions. So big thanks. But yeah, let's give them a hand real quick. So, all right. One of the questions I like to start with is I like to find out a little bit about the person, find out a little bit their background, and then what I start asking about questions that I think are going to lead to stories. So one of my favorite questions to ask is I ask people to tell me about a story of a patient that they'll never forget. Now, my guess is if I asked you that, you would have to think for a minute. And I always tell people, we have thousands and thousands of patients that we've taken care of, but there's probably a couple handful of those patients that you'll never, ever forget. So I ask people to share the story about those. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask them to first share just a quick story about a patient that they'll never forget. So we'll start there. You have the microphone, ma'am. We're going to start with you. You pick.
Well, my story, unfortunately, Kevin and I met, so I told him, he asked me yesterday to think of some things, some patients, and then throw of some more. Most of them are mostly tragedy. And of course, that's often what sticks with us. But the patient that I remember very well was a 60-ish or 70-ish woman who had cancer and was undergoing treatment, but she was brought into the emergency department because of anemia, and she was sort of passing out. To make a long story short, and also she was next to the psych room in which there was a patient who was not quiet. In fact, he was banging his stretcher against the wall and yelling the F word. So this was our setting. I had also other patients. Anyway, I was sort of figuring out what was going on because I had just come on duty, and the daughter of this patient, a patient with cancer, came through the curtains like a flash and said, "I need help. Something's wrong with my mom." And I went in. There was this very blue lady who wasn't blue before, and her O2 sat was 60. I didn't think it could go that low, and still be alive. But anyway, so my quick thought was, put her on a high rebreather, high flow, and put in nasal prongs, which I thought might give her a little bit more while I tried to get help and figure out what was going on. And she also became hypotensive. The oxygen helped her out. Mind you, she was awake and alert during this whole time, despite her O2 sat. Meanwhile, the guy is doing the F word and banging the stretcher against the wall, which added to the tension. We got the lady quickly. Her x-ray showed that she had massive bilateral pulmonary emboli, and which is not uncommon in oncology patients. We were trying to get her stabilized enough to get her transferred to our other hospital where they had open heart capability and could remove this whole massive clot. But she wasn't stabilizing. And I'm sure that my frustration with us not being able to save this lady right away and the guy yelling his words and banging the thing caused me to go to his room and confront him. And I said, violating every HIPAA rule, listen, the lady next to you is dying, and I don't want her to hear your words as her last words. Can you help me with that? And he said yes, and he shut up, and he stopped making all that noise. The lady, of course, died. We couldn't get her to a place where they could do this massive open chest thrombectomy. But several weeks later, I received a thank you note from her daughter for my excellent care. And I kept that note. And if you get notes, keep them, because they help you remember, yeah, it was a bad time, horrible time. And we did great support for our families after a death. But it was gratifying to know that maybe in the end we made her final time on this earth a little better.
That's awesome. What a great story. Thanks for sharing that. Now, that's a good story. One of the things that makes nursing, one of the things I think makes nursing so tough is the amount of tragedy, of other people's tragedy that we end up taking in and being part of. And sometimes the hardest thing is you go in and you have to deal with that. You have to go in and deal with tragedy, and then go in next door with a smile on your face, say, good morning, how you doing? How's it going? Glad you're here. And you're sitting there going, your mind's still back in with the other patient. I remember going in once and had a patient who was coding, and we were coding this guy, and there was a very upset patient who wanted to leave because it was taking a really long time in the emergency department, which we told her it would. And she's like, well, I got to go. She's like, I got this, finger injury or whatever it was. And I was like, all right, you're right. It's an emergency. We're here for you. But I just remember thinking to myself, you don't even know what I'm doing right next door. But they don't know. But that's sometimes a burden we carry as nurses. And part of how we process that is telling those stories. So hopefully you're getting a chance to do that occasionally. That's one of the things that's really fantastic for processing. Billy, I'm going to ask you to share a story. Share a story about a patient that you'll never forget.
Should I share a funny one or a tragic one? What do you guys want? Funny?
Let's go funny. Yeah, let's go funny.
You bummed everyone out. Okay. We have a lot of funny stories. The one that is easiest to pop into mind is somebody who you probably have in many of your departments who comes in, and the emergency department is actually their dialysis center. And they come in there every couple times a week to get their dialysis. This woman had been coming to us for a long time, and this was the first time I ever met her. And she wasn't particularly nice. She was using a lot of the same words as that gentleman was in your story. Many of them directed at me, along with some other words that were directed at me, along with everyone else. It was not, she was equal opportunity with her slurs. And it's, I go into the room and I do my evaluation, and I was able to put an IV in her hand pretty quickly, and that made her like me a little bit more. And throughout the rest of the day, waiting for dialysis to be ready, because, of course, she was not their priority. So she spent a lot of time with us. At one point, she was standing next to the bed, swaying back and forth. And my PCA was like, oh, yeah, she does this many bags of heroin every day, and she's not going to fall down. She's going to stand like that. She's very, very good. And I said, wow, that's really impressive. And we come around again, and at some point she was yelling at someone, and I see puffs of white smoke coming out of her mouth. I'm like, what the hell is going on? And then I walk back to the room, and I see her yelling at somebody, but in between yelling, she's drinking cornstarch out of the cornstarch container. I said, oh, that was what the white smoke was. I understand now. And throughout the rest of my 12-hour shift, while she sat there waiting for dialysis to come and make her their priority, we became pretty friendly. I got her some sandwiches. I got her some food. I was sort of nice to her. I mean, can we curse on this? Sorry. I busted her balls, so to speak, and she appreciated that. And by the end of it, as she was wheeled out of the department, she was like, I like you, Billy. You're all right. I'm going to see you again. And sure enough, I saw her again 2 days later. And then the next week and the next week. And I don't know how I missed this woman up until this point, but every time after that, she made sure to come find me if I was working that day. Yeah, maybe that's what it was. Her dialysis schedule changed to my work schedule.
Is Billy there? If he is, I'm coming in. That's funny. Isn't it funny how, have you ever seen a patient outside of work where you're like, oh, I know you? And you like recognize them, and sometimes they recognize you, sometimes they don't. Sometimes nice when they don't, but sometimes they recognize you. I had a patient who recognized me. There was a gentleman that we were taking care of. He was probably about 6'6" and probably weighed 300 pounds, and he was a big boy, and he was a psych patient. And at some point, he was escalating, and then at some point we were like, okay. So finally he gets up, and he was actually going to beat up another guy down the hall who kept saying, hey, you keep saying you're going to go off. Let's go off. Come on, let's do it. He was the patient was totally egging him on. The patient was totally egging on the other patient. Well, sure enough, he gets up. Me and another guy go and we grab him, and what probably looked like a big giant football tackle. There's 600 pounds of man falling on the floor in the emergency department. We end up getting the guy. Like as soon as he went down on the ground, wind was out of his sails. He was good. He was done. But once he got up, then he was okay. He was crying. He was upset. Well, needless to say, we found out. Well, his dad worked at the hospital. I didn't mention that. His dad worked at the hospital and witnessed the whole thing. Witnessed the whole takedown. And I was like, oh. And he was our guy. He was our guy. I don't know if you have a guy at your hospital that does this. He was our guy that did the patient satisfaction stuff. That would call and do the patient follow-up, right? So he'd be the one to be like apologizing for the hospital and then go back to the hospital and say, hey, here's what happened. He was that guy. And his son was getting tackled in the emergency department, and he witnessed the whole thing. And I remember afterwards, like facing him for the first time going, oh, what are you doing? And he's like, hey, really sorry you had to deal with that. And I'm like, all right, okay. All that was fine. But about a week later, I run into this guy at a restaurant, right? Just happened to run into this guy, and I was like, oh, hey, buddy, how you doing? I was there going, I'm alone now. This is kind of frightening. And he was with a date. And he goes, oh, hey, this is Kevin. Kevin's a really nice guy. He works with my dad. And I was like, yes, I do. Okay. And then I was with my nephew, and my nephew goes, who was that guy? I'm like, it's a really long story. I'll tell you later, but we like football tackled that guy just a couple days ago. And he's like, he's kind of big. And I'm like, yeah, he's kind of big. So, it's crazy, though. It's crazy. The patients will come around, and you'll end up getting to know them. And that's kind of a fun part about being an emergency nurse. All right. You ready? Julianne, tell us a story about a patient that you'll never forget.
Okay.
A little closer.
Sorry. Can everyone hear me? We're good. So I was working in the trauma bay one day, and I was new to the trauma bay, and we had a patient who had run away from a group home and climbed a tree and fallen out of a tree. And he was definitely on some kind of substances, and he had broken both his legs and one arm pretty severely, like some open fractures. And we had to put a Foley in, the whole nine, and we're telling him, listen, you have to go to the OR, and he just wants food. He says, give me a sandwich, I want a sandwich, and I want to leave. I'm like, you can't walk out of here, so you really need to stay. Yeah. We actually had to come and have psych declare him incompetent to make decisions. Wow. So while we're doing this, they're getting the OR ready, and he's like, I want food. And we're like, sir, we can't feed you. If you eat or drink, you won't be able to have emergency surgery. We're explaining this to him. He's like, I don't care. So I'm sitting at the nurse's station, and we're charting, and I hear a slurping noise. And I'm like, what is that? And I turn, and he had ripped out his Foley and was drinking his urine from his Foley. And I had to, I had to call anesthesia.
Psych's like, done,
Yeah.
check.
Actually, it took a while, but I even after that. But I had to call anesthesia and be like, so his last oral intake was now, and it was urine. So
And they're like, who does that?
Yeah, I was like, and he has no Foley now, by the way. So yeah, that was I'll never forget that one for sure.
Oh my gosh, holy cow. Patients do some crazy things, don't they? Now, Julianne, I want to stick with you for just a second, because she is the newest nurse up here. And how many folks have been a nurse 5 years or less? Raise your hand if you've been a nurse 5 years or less. Couple of you. Not as many as we need. We older folks need to go get those younger folks and get them to start coming to things like this. But here's what's interesting. The younger folks, how many folks have residents in their ER, nurse residents in their ER? Few of you do. At my facility, we just hired 20 nurse residents for the 2 emergency departments. Now, in the last year of us hiring residents, some of those residents have had little or no clinical care. They've had little or no, they've done simulations because they weren't able to go into the hospital. So we're getting nurses that are going to be a different kind of nurse than maybe what you got is for clinicals. So it's one of the things to just kind of think about. What I want to talk to, so Juliana wasn't quite that far back, but she was a fairly new nurse at COVID. Do you want to tell us a little bit about when you were kind of just finishing orientation and COVID was running hot and heavy in your ER?
Yeah, I had pretty much just finished orientation. I was off orientation for a few months when COVID started, so I didn't get a ton of experience before that. And then, pretty much all of our patients were COVID for a while. So that was a tough experience because, a lot of COVID patients didn't make it, and you had to witness that. I think a lot more than pre-COVID. I think I witnessed a lot of death that I probably wouldn't have seen until a little bit later in my career. So that was definitely tough for me.
I bet. Just bring the mic just a little bit closer. And how did you, so when we see as new nurses, when our new nurses are seeing things like that, one of the things that we should be thinking about as the more seasoned nurses is like, how are they coping and how are they dealing with that? How did you process like what you were seeing and kind of getting through all that stuff?
I talked with coworkers, and my preceptor's in the audience over there, actually. Hi.
That's
So
awesome.
I talked with her. I talked with my nurse managers, who's also here.
No pressure.
Yeah.
She won't be cussing on stage.
But I think just trying to debrief with coworkers as much as possible, and I would call my coworkers on the way home. My one friend who I used to work with, I would call her while I was driving home, and she was doing her drive home, and we would just both
decompress.
As best we could.
Yeah, I got to tell you, it's one of the things that's really important to do, because we end up keeping a lot of stuff in, and sometimes those bad days. I remember, just a quick show of hands, how many people vividly remember the first patient that they've seen? First patient death. The first patient that you've seen die. So many of us do. And a lot of times, like processing that is sometimes difficult for us. So one of the things I love about stories, and I love about telling nurse stories and hearing nurse stories, is you get a chance to kind of process that through a little bit, and that's an important thing to do. So how has it been starting your career, kind of finishing and getting ready while being, going through a pandemic? Holy cow. It had to have been tough.
Yeah, it was. I'm lucky to have a lot of coworkers that support me. I'm very lucky that we don't really have any of, like, all my coworkers are very supportive. Even though I started as a new grad, I really always felt very supported by the people that I worked with, and that I could ask them for help, and
Yeah,
that they would be here for me, and
That's-
they were.
that's awesome. And you started as a new grad in the ER?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's and she said a lot. I think your preceptor was over here somewhere. She said a lot of nice things about you when we talked earlier too. So, and I didn't even have to pay her to say that. So it's good.
Aw,
It's
shucks.
good. So, all right. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. So, Billy, you work in the education role. How has the pandemic helped, or how has the pandemic changed the way you do your role as an educator?
It's made us a lot busier. There's a lot more people coming, a lot more people going.
Yeah.
Whether it's people leaving to travel, whether it's people just getting burnt out and leaving. There's lots of positions that need to be filled. So luckily we've been able to fill them, but it keeps us pretty busy.
I bet. What's your thoughts on new grads starting in the emergency department?
For it.
Love it?
I mean, I was basically, I worked, so I was lucky enough to graduate in 2009 when the housing bubble crashed and lots of hospitals in New Jersey shut down and there weren't any nursing jobs. And I got to paint houses for a year with a nursing degree while I applied for job after job after job.
Holy cow.
And the first job I was able to get was in adolescent psychiatry. But I only worked there for about 9 months before moving to the ER. So I was basically a new grad in the ER also.
Yeah.
So I'm totally for it.
Yeah.
But it's a huge responsibility. You know, in some cases it's ignorance is bliss, right? Those nurses that have come from the floor know all the things that can go wrong and get, oh my God, what's happening here? Whereas the new grads don't know any better. They're like, oh, this is normal. This is fine.
Like, this is the normal bad, right? Like, yeah, it's kind of funny. It seems like the goalpost keeps changing for like what's normal and what's good.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Tell us a story about a patient that made you laugh that you'll never forget. Let's lighten this up a little bit.
So it wasn't my patient, but I was working with another nurse who, like I'm sure we've all worked with, is not the most organized person in the world and might have been a little scatterbrained. And she had a woman who was maybe committed, maybe in the middle of a behavioral health workup, I don't remember, but she lost her. She couldn't find her. Then we checked the bathrooms, and we checked the waiting room, and we checked outside around the hospital, and we paged her overhead, and I was looking, and she was looking, and our coworkers were looking, and security was looking, and the resource nurses were looking, and 30 minutes go by, 40 minutes go by, an hour goes by. She's ignored all of her patients. I ignored all of my patients because we had to find this one person who might have left the hospital until we hear some giggling in the corner. And I look down at the ground, and I see 2 feet wrapped up in the curtain so that nobody could see her in the corner of the room. And she had been looking at us through the little mesh in the curtain, looking at everyone running around looking for her while she was standing right in the room.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. What a funny story. Let me ask Peggy. Peggy, I have a question for you. Yeah. Now, you're not a new nurse.
No.
But you had an interesting story from when you were a new nurse.
Let's see, which one? Was that one in Vietnam?
No, it was the burn patient.
Oh. When I was, where I went to school was Philadelphia General Hospital, and it's a city hospital for Philadelphia. And in order to be a patient there, you had to be indigent unless it was a life-threatening emergency. And it was not uncommon for patients to live there for the rest of their lives. I mean, not a lot of them, but, patients who had, this was in 1963. We didn't have Medicare, for example, and didn't have nursing homes like we do today. Anyway, each of us as a student nurse had a big sister, which I think we should, when you come into a new unit, you should have a big brother or a big sister. But anyway, my big sister warned me about this patient, Mr. R. And she wouldn't say more about this patient other than just be forewarned. And he's on the surgical unit, so he had already been there at least 2 or 3 years. He had had multiple skin grafts. He had about 99% burns. He had no real ears. He had no real eyelashes. He had no eyelashes. He had no real eyelids. He had no eyebrows. His mouth was pretty much contracted, closed, although, they had opened it enough so he could eat. But anyway, he enjoyed scaring the hell out of new nurses. And he would know when a new group was coming onto the unit and, would hide and then pop out and, boo. And he knew he looked pretty grotesque. And he was pretty grotesque. And he was also not a very nice person. I think that he may have had some mental health issues before he got burned, and that may have been how he ended up getting burned. I don't remember now. But I remember he went to the operating room at least once a week for skin grafts. And one day, I had him as a patient. He came back from the operating room with a black scalp. He was a Caucasian man. And his skin graft was from a black donor. And I'm like, well, that's a new one on me, and we wouldn't let him look in the mirror. We didn't want him to know that because he was also pretty racist, that he had, the skin of a kind black donor. Anyway, I think that, when I left, he was still there, and that was 3 years, so I think he ended his life ended, at that hospital, but he was never going to be able to return to society. But yeah, his joy in life was scaring the nurses.
Now, you mentioned, hold on to the mic for just a second. You mentioned Vietnam. You were a nurse in Vietnam. Yes. Tell us a little bit about being a nurse during the war.
Well, I was in the Army Student Nurse Program, which they need to bring back, but the Army Student Nurse Program, basically, you joined in your senior year of nursing school, and they paid you a stipend of $98 a month as a E3, enlisted E3. Can you imagine $98 a month for an E3? But anyway, but for us, it was like a lot of money. My tuition for 3 years of nursing school at that time was $500. That was books, uniform, lodging, and plus they gave us $10 a month, spending money. Those were the days. Anyway, I joined the Army Student Nurse Program really towards the end of my senior year in November. We graduated in August the following year. And I joined because there was a doctor named Tom Dooley, who was a doctor who founded an organization called Medico. And he was providing care to the citizens of Laos and Vietnam. He was a medical missionary, but not a clergy, but he was a doctor. And he wrote several books about his experiences, and unfortunately, he died from melanoma at a very young age, but it sort of made me want to go to Vietnam. So I joined the Army Student Nurse Program, and then after I passed my boards, you couldn't take boards for 6 months until after you graduated. Okay? She worked as a graduate nurse before you could, get your RN. And so once I graduated, and once I passed my boards and was officially licensed, then I was inducted into the Army. Went to Fort Sam Houston for basic training, and then to South Carolina, where Vietnam was just starting. And it was the responsibility of every officer, nurse corps officer, to rotate through every unit in the hospital. Now, mind you, my expertise had been neurology, neurosurgery. That was my love. Well, they didn't have neurosurgery at that hospital. So we got rotated through OB. I'm like, I don't know nothing about birth and no babies. But I guess they figured since we were just out of school, we should know something about OB, and, surgery and stuff like that, operating room, which was not a problem because in my program I had 3 months of OR nursing. But then they sent me to the emergency room, and I went kicking and screaming because as a student, I had worked in the emergency department. It was called the accident ward. at Philadelphia General, and I thought, nurses don't do anything except carry out doctor's orders. Anyway, when I went to the kicking and screaming to the, it was called Receiving an Emergency there, I quickly discovered my love. So my message is never, look, explore all opportunities, because if I had not been assigned there, I don't think I'd be here today. Anyway, I let them know that I wanted to go to Vietnam, and they obliged. So with only about a year of nursing experience, I got sent to Vietnam. And the first hospital I sent to, I asked for either receiving an emergency or neurosurgery. They sent me to a hospital that didn't have neurosurgery and put me on medical ICU. What's wrong with this picture? But it's the Army. Anyway, so eventually I got to rotate through receiving as part of my orientation, and that really gelled my interest in doing that. I was at the first assignment for about 2 months, and then TET was happening, and they decided that we needed to open up a new hospital up north, and it was a MASH unit. I mean, it wasn't called a MASH, it was an evac hospital, but it was like MASH. And we were intense in TENTS. It was intense. We were intense. And the wards were intense. Our quarters were all intense, with rockets and mortars flying in at Wisdom, at Liv. And sandbags. We learned how to fill sandbags. But we also learned that nurses had to triage casualties. If we knew that we were getting casualties, we would call the first team in. They would come, the surgeons would come in and triage the patients, but often they were already in the operating room, so was second team and third team. So as nurses, we triage. So here I am, a year out of school, making decisions that we're going to operate on somebody or we're going to put somebody in a corner. And it was the best of the year and the worst of year. It was a very sobering experience, and sort of makes me cry when I think about Ukraine, and also about our people who did Afghanistan and Kuwait and all that. But when I came back from Vietnam, I felt that there was nothing I would ever experience in civilian life that I was not prepared for as a result of that experience. But I think what Kevin wants me to talk about was, I had a patient who was on R&R in Vietnam, a soldier, going on R&R. He was in a bus. The bus hit a mine or whatever, and he ended up banging the back of his head on the bar on the back of the seat, and he was brought in as comatose with a closed head injury, although we didn't call it that then. And he was having some airway problems. And I asked the neurosurgeon if we trached patients acutely then. I think we might have also been concerned that he might have had a tracheal injury. I don't remember why, but the neurosurgeon was reluctant to put in any kind of invasive airway, which I didn't understand. Now, in a combat situation, your mission is to do the greatest good for the greatest number and to put your resources to return people to duty. I know that might sound cruel, but that's what a mission is in a military setting, in a combat setting. Anyway, the doctor finally acquiesced and put allowed us to trach him, but he didn't put in a cuff tube. He would not allow a cuff tube, which meant you couldn't put him on a ventilator. And in retrospect, and of course, we watched him die. And I was telling Kevin, I had a rule: no man will die alone, no person will die alone. And so I sat at his bedside watching him die. And he didn't have a survivable injury, But I didn't understand that at the time. And it would have been good if the neurosurgeon had said, look, he's not going to make it. And putting in this airway wasn't really doing anything good for him. It was good for me, but not for him. But it made me realize that we don't really teach nurses about what is a survivable injury and what isn't. And sometimes some of the pain that we experience as nurses, particularly in traumas, are in people we can't save. But it's not our emergency, it's the patient's emergency, and we need to learn how to differentiate from that. Does that cover what you wanted me to talk about?
That's perfect. That's perfect. Now, what I really hope you take home from this message is you have stories. You have lots of stories. You also have lots of new nurses who are working with you, would be my guess. Or lots of new nurses who need guidance and who need mentorship. So one of the things I would encourage you to do is share those stories, because that's how we learn. We learn best when we share those stories. So you ER nurses are amazing. You're amazing people. You've done amazing things. Even pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, holy cow, you guys have been absolutely incredible. And we know it's tough, but here we are. And here we are learning more about emergency nursing and how to be a better ER nurse. So one, I want to thank you for making the commitment to this profession. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this organization. And thanks for sharing your wisdom. And don't forget to share your stories. Share your stories with those who can learn from your stories. Because there's a lot to learn from the stories that we shared here today. The last thing I want to do is I want to thank my guests for being on the stage with me and sharing their great stories. Let's give them a hand. It takes a lot of courage to get up here and get in front of your peers. It's easy for me. I've done it a little bit, but to have people come up here and get in front of their peers and tell their stories, I would just thank them so much for doing that. So if you have a great story you want to share with me, I'm going to be putting this interview on my podcast. It'll be coming to the podcast soon. And if you have a great story, then what you can do is record it on your phone, record it as an MP3, send it to me at this email address here, and I'm going to have a second podcast with your stories, if you care to share them. Okay? Guys, thanks for listening to me. I really appreciate you sticking it out, and thank you for being part of this conference. And thank you to the New Jersey crew for inviting me to be here. Thanks so much. You guys. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. And don't worry, you are going to get a chance to hear more from the 3 nurses that were on the podcast, because they have so many more stories to tell. I want to say a big thank you to them, and a big thank you to the crew at the ECC conference in New Jersey, Atlantic City. You guys are phenomenal hosts. I can't wait to come back next year. I hope I get the opportunity to do that. Well, thanks for listening to the podcast. I hope you enjoyed, and have a great shift.
Thanks for listening to the Art of Emergency Nursing podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Facebook.